A black woman living in a Chinese village falls in love with a cold-hearted CEO from Shanghai. As they neared the hotel, Lu Liting suddenly stopped. "There's something about you, Celine," he said quietly. "Something that scares me." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because you make me want things I never thought I'd want." The confession sent a shiver through her. She knew she should say something wise, something safe. But all she could whisper was, "Like what?" His gaze darkened. "Like faith," he murmured, "like hope. And then even softer, like you." Celine's heart pounded. This was dangerous. If she let her emotions lead, she could get caught in something she wasn't meant to be part of. And yet, she cared for him, deeply. The way Lu Liting looked at her, intense, searching, made it impossible to breathe. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of control. For once, his guard was down, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Longing. Celine closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Lord, help me do what's right." Because right now, the line between wisdom and desire was far too thin. But when she opened her eyes and saw the vulnerability in his expression, something inside her cracked. Without thinking, she stepped closer. And then, before fear could stop her, she reached up and kissed him. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if testing the weight of this moment. But when he responded, his hands sliding gently to her waist, his lips pressing against hers with more certainty, Celine felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something that scared her. The warmth of his touch sent shivers through her. But before she lost herself completely, she forced herself to pull away. Lu Liting's breath was uneven, his forehead resting against hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "I don't want to lose you." Celine swallowed hard. "You won't," she whispered. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her heart. She wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. The weight of his confession lingered, stirring something deep inside her. She had spent her life believing love should be steady, unwavering, like the quiet, faithful devotion she had seen in her parents. But this was different. And for the first time in a long while, she thought of home. Jingmei. The village of Jingmei, China, was nestled between rolling hills and endless fields of golden wheat, a place where life moved unhurriedly, where mornings were greeted by the chirping of birds and evenings ended with the scent of burning firewood in the air. It was the only home Celine had ever known. Her parents, devoted missionaries from Kenya, had moved to Jingmei years before she was born, dedicating their lives to serving the people. Though they had never been wealthy, their home was always filled with warmth, faith, and an unwavering sense of purpose. Celine had grown up watching them care for the sick, teach the children, and speak of God's love with tireless devotion. They were ordinary, but their love for others made them extraordinary. At 17, Celine was in her final year of high school, her future uncertain. She had always been a diligent student, but she had yet to figure out what she wanted to do with her life. University was the next step, but the thought of leaving the familiar comforts of Jingmei unsettled her. That evening, however, the only thing on her mind was the grand celebration at the Luo family's compound. Grandpa Luo was one of the most respected elders in the village, a man whose kindness and wisdom had earned him the love of many. The Luo family had lived in Jingmei for generations, though only Grandpa Luo remained. His children had moved away, including his grandson Lu Liting, who had built a life in the vast city of Shanghai. Lu Liting's visit was a rare event, and the entire village was abuzz with excitement. Grandpa Luo had spared no effort in preparing for the occasion, inviting everyone to join the feast in honor of his grandson. It was a night of music, food, and laughter, a gathering where the village's tight-knit spirit shone the brightest. Celine's mother had chosen a simple blue dress for her that evening. It wasn't new or extravagant, but it complemented her slender figure and contrasted beautifully against her dark, wavy hair. She wasn't one to focus on her appearance, but for some reason she had taken extra care to braid her hair neatly that evening. Perhaps deep down, she already knew that something about this night would change her. As she walked toward the Luo compound with her parents, the lively sounds of celebration filled the air. Lanterns hung from wooden posts, casting a golden glow over the courtyard. Tables were laden with steaming dishes, roasted duck, fresh vegetables, sweet buns, and bowls of jasmine rice. The scent of spices mixed with the crisp night air. It was a night unlike any other. And then he arrived. Lulitin stepped into the courtyard, and for the first time in her life, Celine felt time slow. He was nothing like she had imagined. Dressed in a crisp black shirt and tailored trousers, he looked like he belonged to an entirely different world, one far beyond the modest simplicity of Jingmei. He was tall, with sharp, chiseled features, his jet black hair perfectly styled. But what struck Celine the most were his eyes. Cold, unreadable. There was a quiet intensity about him, as if he had built walls around himself that no one could cross. The villagers greeted him with warmth, some offering firm handshakes, others embracing him like a long-lost son. But though he responded politely, he did not smile. Celine stood at the edge of the gathering, watching in silent awe. Her heart pounded in her chest, an unfamiliar flutter she had never felt before. Was this what they called love at first sight? It sounded ridiculous, impossible even. Yet, there she stood, unable to take her eyes off him. She was certain that he hadn't even noticed her. Throughout the evening, Lulitin remained reserved. He spoke only when spoken to, answering questions with curt nods and measured words. He barely touched the food in front of him, his mind seemingly elsewhere. It was clear that he wasn't accustomed to such lively gatherings. Celine's father, who always took an interest in people, made an effort to engage him in conversation. "You must be very busy in Shanghai," he said kindly. Lulitin gave a small nod. "Yes, work takes up most of my time. Do you enjoy what you do?" A flicker of something unreadable passed through Lulitin's gaze before he responded. "I don't think much about enjoyment." Celine observed him carefully, intrigued yet saddened by his detached demeanor. How could someone so young look so burdened? She wanted to know more about him. What had made him this way? The thought startled her. What did it matter? He was a stranger, a man who would leave by morning, returning to a life she could never be part of. Yet even as she told herself this, she found herself memorizing every detail. The way he ran a hand through his hair when deep in thought. The way his eyes darkened when he spoke about his work. The way he barely acknowledged the laughter around him. She hadn't spoken a single word to him, and still, he had changed something inside her. The night carried on, and soon the celebration began to wind down. The villagers slowly started to leave, bidding farewell to Grandpa Luo and his grandson. Celine's parents stood to go, and she followed, casting one last glance at the man who had unknowingly captured her heart. He didn't look her way, not even once. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Lulitin was gone. Celine woke to the news that he had left early, taking the first train back to Shanghai. He had left just as he had come, quietly, without fanfare. She knew she would likely never see him again. And yet, even as she sat on the steps of her home, watching the village stir awake, her heart refused to forget him. She was just a nameless girl in the crowd to him. But to her, he had become unforgettable. The dusty paths of Jingmei village stretched behind Celine, like threads of a life she wasn't quite ready to leave. The scent of freshly turned earth, the distant chatter of villagers finishing their day's work, and the familiar sight of her parents sitting by the porch, reading their well-worn Bibles. All of it was home. Yet change was coming. Celine had always known she would leave one day. It was an unspoken truth, one her parents had prepared her for. Higher education was a privilege, one she had fought for, and now it was time to embrace it. But there was an ache deep in her chest, a quiet sadness she couldn't shake. She stood outside their small house, staring at the fading horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the rolling hills and vast cities, Lu Teen was living a life she could barely imagine. The thought was ridiculous. She had never spoken to him, had never even been on the receiving end of a single glance from him. He was a ghost in her mind, an image burned into her heart from one fleeting encounter. Yet after all these years, she could not forget him. Celine's new life at university was nothing like the simple, slow-paced days in Jingmei village. The university town was bustling and alive, filled with students from different backgrounds, some from rich families, others like her, dreamers from small towns trying to carve a place for themselves in a world that often overlooked them. She pursued a business degree, though a part of her still felt uncertain about what she truly wanted. It seemed like a practical choice. Business was stable, useful, but was it her calling? At first, university was overwhelming. The fast-paced lectures, the endless assignments, the expectations, it felt like she was drowning. And then there was money. Her parents, though loving, couldn't afford to send her much beyond her tuition. She never resented them for it. Their sacrifices had always been for others, and she had grown up knowing that true wealth was in kindness and faith. But still, she needed to survive. She found a part-time job at a small cafe near campus, working late shifts and early mornings just to afford the bare minimum. Some nights, exhaustion consumed her, but she never complained. She was building her future, one small step at a time. Still, in the quiet hours when her mind wandered, she thought of him. It frustrated her, how Lu Teen had become a shadow in her thoughts. How was it possible to hold on to a memory so tightly when the person in question had never even acknowledged her existence? She tried to forget. She told herself it was foolish, but deep down, she knew the truth. Despite her uncertainties, one thing never wavered: her faith. She prayed often, pouring her heart out to God, asking for clarity, for purpose. Her father's words lingered in her mind, guiding her in ways she didn't fully understand yet. Business isn't just about money, Celine. It can be a tool to serve others. If you truly want to make an impact, go where God leads you. Those words took root in her heart, growing slowly, shaping her decisions. As time passed, she stopped seeing her business degree as just a means to an end. She began to see it as a calling. What if she could use it to help others? What if she could combine faith and business to bring change in places that needed it? The questions excited her. They gave her hope. But dreams didn't erase struggles. Balancing university and work was hard. There were nights when she barely had time to eat, weeks where the weight of assignments and financial stress felt like an impossible mountain to climb. She often saw her classmates, those from wealthy backgrounds, living a life she couldn't even dream of. They talked about vacations in Europe, about designer clothes, about summer internships at their parents' companies. Celine had none of that, but she had something else: determination. She refused to let her background define her. She worked harder than anyone else, staying up late to study, taking extra shifts at the cafe, finding ways to save money on textbooks. Every sacrifice she made was a step toward her future. And yet she still felt something missing. There was still a quiet whisper in her heart, telling her that she wasn't where she was meant to be yet. She ignored it for a long time, until one day she couldn't anymore. As graduation approached, Celine found herself at a crossroads. Her classmates had their futures lined up. Some had jobs waiting for them, others were staying in town. But she felt restless. The idea of staying in the same town, working a small corporate job, living a life of quiet stability, it didn't feel right. She wanted more. One evening, as she sat by her dormitory window, staring at the city skyline, she thought about her father's words again. Go where God leads you. It was then that she made a decision. She would go to Shanghai. It was a bold move. She had no job lined up, no safety net, but she had heard about internship opportunities in some of Shanghai's biggest companies. If she wanted to truly test herself, to grow beyond the world she had known, she had to take this leap. She didn't know what awaited her there. She only knew one thing: Lu Teen was in Shanghai. Not that it mattered. Not that she was doing this because of him. Or at least, that's what she told herself. What she didn't know was that this decision would change her life forever. Celine had always imagined life in a big city would be glamorous. Exciting nights, beautiful streets, endless opportunities. Shanghai laughed at her dreams. Nothing had prepared her for the brutal reality of city life. For starters, the subway system was a beast of its own. She had watched a few tutorial videos before arriving, thinking she understood how it worked. But the moment she stepped into the station, she realized she was completely outmatched. Her first attempt at boarding a train ended in absolute disaster. She hesitated at the entrance, unsure if this was her train, a rookie mistake. Before she could step in, a wave of commuters pushed past her, sweeping her away like a helpless twig in a raging river. By the time she regained her balance, the train doors had closed in her face. She groaned, adjusting the strap of her purse. At this rate, she was going to be late on her first day. And late she was. When she finally arrived at Litin Enterprises, breathless and flustered, she realized another problem. The building was way too fancy for her budget-conscious wardrobe. The receptionist, a woman with a sharp bob and even sharper eyes, glanced at Celine's outfit, a simple blouse, slacks, and scuffed flats. The judgment was instant. "Intern orientation is on the 22nd floor," she said, voice clipped. Celine forced a polite smile. She had survived the Shanghai subway. She would survive this too. Celine had imagined their reunion 100 different ways. Maybe he would do a double take and say, "Celine from Jingmei Village, I can't believe it's you." Or perhaps there would be a spark of recognition in his eyes, some sign that he remembered her from years ago. Instead, the moment she stepped into Lu Litin's office, he barely looked up. "Miss Celine, correct?" His voice was cool, emotionless. She swallowed, nodding. "Yes, sir." He flipped through a file, scanning her resume. His expression remained unreadable. "My grandfather speaks highly of you." There it was. She knew she hadn't gotten this internship through her own merit, not entirely. Grandpa Luo had intervened. She braced herself for the disdain that might follow. Instead, he simply shut the file and said, "Don't expect special treatment. Do your job well or you're out." And just like that, he dismissed her. Celine left his office, her heart sinking. All her fantasies of instant recognition and connection were gone. The man before her was a stranger. If Celine had thought the subway was brutal, it was nothing compared to office culture. Her supervisor, Ms. Tang, was a meticulous, no-nonsense woman with a talent for making interns cry. Celine's first task, sorting through hundreds of financial reports. "This needs to be done before noon," Ms. Tang instructed, dropping a towering stack of files onto Celine's desk. Celine glanced at the clock. It was already 11:15 a.m. "Before noon," she repeated. Ms. Tang gave her a thin smile. "Unless you want to start your internship on a bad note." Celine plastered on a determined smile. "Of course not." She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. By some miracle and a lot of frantic typing, she finished at exactly 11:59 a.m. She slammed the last file shut, victorious. Then she knocked over her coffee. The entire stack of papers was instantly soaked in dark liquid. Celine's soul left her body. Before she could react, Lu Litin appeared. He took in the disaster before her, soaked financial reports, her panicked expression. His face remained unreadable. Celine waited for the scolding, the look of disappointment. Instead, he sighed and pressed a button on his phone. "Ms. Tang, the intern needs a fresh set of reports." Ms. Tang's voice crackled through the speaker, clearly irritated. "Sir, we don't have backups." Lu Litin glanced at Celine, then give her the digital files. There was a brief pause. "Understood, sir." He turned back to Celine. "Accidents happen. Next time, be more careful." And with that, he walked away. Celine blinked. Did he just defend her? Days turned into weeks, and Celine found herself falling into a rhythm. Wake up, fight the subway, battle office politics, avoid making a fool of herself in front of Lu Litin. Repeat. And yet, no matter how much she tried, her feelings for him refused to die. It was frustrating. How could she still feel something for someone who barely acknowledged her existence? But then there were moments when she would catch him staring at her, moments when he would pause before responding, as if searching for a memory just out of reach. Moments when his cold mask would slip just for a second. And every time Celine found herself hoping. One evening, Celine stayed late at the office, finishing a report. She was the only one left on the floor, except for him. Lulitin stood near the window, gazing at the Shanghai skyline. The city lights reflected in his dark eyes, making him look lonely. Celine hesitated before speaking. "You work too much," she blurted out. He turned, arching an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" She immediately regretted it. Why did she say that? I just mean. She scrambled for an explanation. Even CEOs need a break, right? For a moment, he simply stared at her. Then to her shock, he said, "You're one to talk. You're still here too." She grinned. "Well, I'm an intern. I have no choice." A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. "Neither do I." Celine's breath caught. Was that a joke? Before she could process it, he turned back to the window. "It's different when you run everything," he said after a pause. "People expect you to be perfect." Celine tilted her head. "That sounds exhausting." He let out a quiet exhale. "It is." And for a brief moment, Celine saw it, a glimpse of vulnerability. Her heart ached. Maybe he wasn't as far gone as she thought. Maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. Celine wasn't sure if she imagined it, but after that late-night conversation, something seemed to shift. Lulitin didn't suddenly become warm. Not at all. He was still distant, still intimidating, still impossible to read. But there were small moments, fleeting, barely noticeable, where she felt he wasn't as cold as he pretended to be. Like when she caught him watching her from across the office, only for him to immediately turn away. Or when he would walk past her desk and pause for half a second too long before giving her some unnecessary critique about her work. Or when he would correct a mistake in her reports before handing them to Ms. Tang, without saying a word, as if covering for her without letting her know. It was confusing. One minute he would act as if she was just another intern. The next, he would say something that made her heart race. And just as she would start to believe she was getting through to him, he would shut down completely. One afternoon, she was heading to the break room when she saw him standing by the window again, looking out over the city. She hesitated. Something about the way he stood, the rigid tension in his shoulders, the distant look in his eyes, reminded her of the boy she had known in Jingmei. Before she could think twice, she walked up to him. "Are you always this serious?" she asked, forcing a light tone. He blinked, as if pulled from deep thoughts. Then his mask slipped just for a second. His lips twitched. "Are you always this nosy?" Celine gasped dramatically. "That was almost a joke. I'm making progress." For a fraction of a second he looked amused. And then the coldness returned. His expression shuttered, his eyes hardened. "You're here to work, not to analyze me," he said, turning away. Celine's stomach twisted. There it was again. That invisible wall he kept rebuilding the moment she got too close. She forced a smile. "Noted, sir." And just like that, the moment was gone. Celine tried to focus on her work, but it was impossible. The more she was around Lulitin, the more she realized that beneath the ice there was something else. But he wouldn't let anyone see it. She wasn't sure why that frustrated her so much. It didn't help that the office itself was a battlefield. One afternoon, Celine was carrying a stack of reports when she tripped over her own feet. The files went flying, right into Lulitin's chest. He barely flinched. Celine, on the other hand, wanted to sink into the floor. I'm so sorry," she stammered, bending to pick up the papers. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then as she scrambled to collect the scattered documents, she heard him murmur, "You're still as clumsy as ever." Her hands froze. She looked up at him, heart pounding. Did he just... But before she could say anything, his expression closed off again. "Be more careful next time," he said curtly before walking away. Celine stared after him, her thoughts racing. So he did remember. He just pretended he didn't. One evening, Celine found herself working late again. She had been so focused on finishing a report that she hadn't noticed the time until she glanced at the clock and saw that it was almost 10 p.m. The office was nearly empty, except for him. Lu Liting was sitting at his desk, rubbing his temples as he stared at his computer screen. Celine hesitated. Then, before she could stop herself, she walked up to his desk and placed a small bottle in front of him. He looked up, frowning. "What's this?" "Eye drops," she said. "You've been staring at the screen all day." He stared at the bottle for a long moment. Then something unreadable flashed in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. Celine's breath caught. It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. She gave him a small smile. "See, I'm not completely useless." For a second, his expression softened. Then just as quickly, he shut himself off again. "I don't need your concern," he said flatly, setting the bottle aside. Celine's smile faded. "There it is again." She bit her lip, forcing herself to nod. "Of course, sir." And with that, she turned and walked away, but she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her go. Celine didn't understand him. Why did he push her away every time she got close? Why did he pretend not to remember her, only to let things slip when he thought she wasn't paying attention? And most importantly, why did she still care so much? She sighed, looking out over the Shanghai skyline. Maybe she was foolish for thinking she could reach him. Maybe the boy she had fallen for in Jingmai was gone forever. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder. Was there still something left of him? And if there was he worth the fight? Celine was determined to excel at Liting Enterprises, even if her boss barely acknowledged her existence. Lu Liting was a man of few words, especially when it came to her. At first, she thought he genuinely didn't care whether she was in the office or not. He never addressed her directly unless it was necessary, and when he did, it was always short, clinical, and distant. But as the days passed, she started to notice the small things. He would linger just a second too long when he passed by her desk. During meetings, when she spoke, his gaze would flick to her, not obviously, but enough for her to feel it. And sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, she caught a hint of something in his eyes, as if he was watching her, measuring her, but refusing to let himself react. It was frustrating. One moment he was indifferent. The next, he was studying her like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Celine didn't know what to make of it. Her chance to prove herself came unexpectedly. A last-minute meeting was called to discuss an upcoming partnership with an international firm. Celine, as an intern, wasn't expected to do much, just take notes and observe. But as she sat at the long glass conference table, listening to the executives struggle to come up with a viable strategy, an idea formed in her mind. It was risky. But before she could talk herself out of it, she spoke up. "With all due respect," she said, her voice steady, "why not adjust the proposal to focus on local markets first? If we position the brand with an initial domestic launch, we can build credibility before expanding globally." The room fell silent. Celine's heart pounded. Had she overstepped? Then a voice broke the silence. "That's an interesting point," Lu Liting said. Celine froze. He was looking directly at her, his sharp eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. She'd never seen him react to her this way before. "Explain your reasoning," he said. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay composed. For the next 5 minutes, she laid out her argument, backing it with market research and consumer trends. When she finished, there was a long pause. Then one of the executives nodded. "That could work." Another chimed in. "It's a fresh approach." Celine couldn't believe it. They were actually considering her idea. And Lu Liting, he didn't say anything, but for the first time he truly looked at her. Not as just an intern, but as someone worth noticing. After that meeting, things changed. Lu Liting didn't suddenly become warm. He was still reserved, still distant, but something had shifted. Their paths crossed more often now, sometimes by accident, sometimes not. She would walk past the hallway, only to find him coming from the opposite direction. They would exchange glances during meetings, his eyes unreadable. At times, she swore she could feel his gaze on her when she was working, but every time she looked up, he was already looking away. And there was tension, undeniable, unspoken. It buzzed between them like electricity. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew she wasn't imagining it. One night, she stayed late at the office, finishing up some reports. She was on her way to the break room when she heard voices from the executive lounge. She wasn't one to eavesdrop, but then she heard his name. "You shouldn't keep everything bottled up, Li Tin." It was Grandpa Luo's voice. "I don't need to talk about it," came Lu Li Tin's quiet but tense reply. "She was your mother," Grandpa Luo said softly. "You never even let yourself grieve properly." Celine's breath caught. "Mother? She abandoned me," Lu Li Tin said. His voice was hard, emotionless. "What else is there to say?" Grandpa Luo sighed. "Not all wounds heal by ignoring them." There was a long silence. Then Lu Li Tin muttered, "I don't have time for this." Celine quickly stepped away before they saw her. Her heart was racing. Suddenly everything made sense. His coldness, his walls. Lu Li Tin wasn't just an arrogant CEO. He was someone who had been deeply hurt. And no matter how much she tried to reach him, he wasn't ready to let anyone in. That night, after overhearing the conversation between Lu Li Tin and Grandpa Luo, Selene lay awake in her tiny apartment, her mind filled with questions. Her heart ached for him. She had spent weeks frustrated by his distant, cold demeanor. Now, she finally understood why. But understanding didn't make things easier. If anything, it made her feelings even more complicated. Her attraction to him had started as a foolish crush back in Jingmei. But now she wasn't just drawn to the powerful businessman he had become. She was drawn to the wounded soul behind the title. A part of her longed to reach him, to show him that he wasn't alone. But another part of her knew she was treading on dangerous ground. She had always believed in prayer, and tonight she needed it more than ever. She slid to her knees beside her bed, clasping her hands together. "Lord, I don't know what to do." Her voice was a whisper in the quiet room. "I see his pain. I see how he pushes people away, but I also see the man behind the walls. I don't know why you brought me here, but I don't want my emotions to lead me where you haven't called me to be. Please, if this is just my heart being foolish, take these feelings away. And if you have a purpose in all of this, show me how to walk wisely." She exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and uncertainty settling over her. Praying didn't erase her feelings, but it reminded her that she didn't have to navigate them alone. She wasn't going to try to change Lu Li Tin. She wasn't going to chase after something that wasn't meant for her, but she would pray for him, for healing, for peace, and for the walls around his heart to someday, if God willed it, come down. The cold air of Shanghai brushed against the towering glass walls of Li Tin Enterprises, but inside the grand office, another kind of chill lingered, the one between Celine and Lu Li Tin. Despite working under him for months, Celine still felt like a stranger in his world. He was distant, controlled, yet every now and then something shifted. A glance that lasted too long, a hesitation before he dismissed her, a fleeting softness in his gaze before he turned away. Celine wasn't sure what it meant, but Grandpa Luo noticed. Grandpa Luo had been staying in Shanghai for a few weeks now, enjoying his time in the bustling city while visiting his grandson. He had long sensed the deep loneliness in Lu Li Tin, the guarded way he carried himself. But lately, he noticed something new, something different. One evening, over a quiet dinner in Lu Li Tin's penthouse, the old man took a slow sip of his tea before speaking. "She reminds me of your grandmother." Lu Li Tin, who had been staring absently at the skyline, frowned. "Who?" "Celine," Grandpa Luo said simply. A muscle ticked in Lu Li Tin's jaw. "I barely speak to her." "Exactly," Grandpa Luo chuckled. "Yet you notice her, don't you?" Lu Li Tin remained silent, unwilling to give an answer. "Not all love ends in pain, my boy." Grandpa Luo's voice was soft, yet firm. "I know what happened with your mother scarred you. But not every woman walks away. Some stay, some fight for love." Lu Li Tin's grip on his glass tightened. He didn't want to talk about his mother or love. "Just be careful, grandson." Grandpa Luo gave him a knowing look. "When you push away the wrong person, you might end up pushing away something precious." Lu Li Tin said nothing. But later that night, as he sat alone in his office, he found himself thinking about Celine, about the way she looked at him with unwavering determination, the way she never backed down from a challenge, the way she carried herself with faith in a world that had taught him only doubt. He told himself it was nothing. Yet that very night something shifted between them. Celine had been assigned to a crucial project, a massive expansion deal that required long hours and meticulous planning. She was determined to prove herself, to show that she belonged in the corporate world. It was well past midnight when she found herself alone in the office with him. Lulitin sat across from her, his sleeves rolled up, focused on the figures on his screen. The only sound in the room was the ticking of the clock and the faint hum of Shanghai's nightlife below. Celine stifled a yawn and reached for a folder. At the same moment, Lulitin reached for his pen. Their hands brushed. It was nothing. And yet it was everything. Celine froze. So did he. The warmth of his touch lingered longer than it should have. For a second, just a brief, stolen second, he didn't pull away. Then suddenly he did. "Focus," he muttered, standing abruptly. The moment was over, but Celine felt it, and so did he. After that night, Lulitin started noticing her. Not in the way he had before, distant and indifferent. Now he watched her closely. He saw the way she refused to give up, even when others underestimated her. He saw the way she spoke with conviction, standing by her ideas, even when she was nervous. And he saw the way she prayed. One evening, as Lulitin returned to the office late, he took the stairs to the rooftop garden, a quiet sanctuary reserved for executives. What he didn't expect was to see her. Celine was kneeling by a small fountain, hands clasped, her lips moving in silent prayer. The soft glow of the city lights illuminated her face, her expression one of peace and devotion. Lulitin stood frozen in the shadows, something inside him stirring. Why was she praying? Was she troubled? Or was this simply who she was, a woman who sought God in the midst of life's chaos? He didn't know why, but he found himself wanting to understand her. But just as the thought crossed his mind, he turned away. No, he couldn't let himself get involved. He had built walls around his heart for a reason. And no matter how drawn he was to her, he wasn't about to let those walls crumble. The crisp Shanghai air greeted Celine as she rose from her knees, brushing off the fabric of her dress. The weight in her heart felt lighter, as it always did after she spent time with God. "Lord, if this is just admiration, help me let go," she murmured. "But if you have a purpose in all this, help me walk in wisdom." She turned, ready to leave the rooftop garden, when she caught a movement from the shadows. Someone was there. Her breath hitched as Lulitin stepped into the dim glow of the city lights. His tall frame was rigid, his hands shoved into his pockets. He had been watching her. "CEO Lu," she started, her voice uncertain. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his tone unreadable. Celine blinked, unsure of how to respond. The cold, untouchable man she worked under had never shown this side before. Quiet, hesitant, almost as if he was curious. "It's all right," she finally said. A silence stretched between them. Lulitin's gaze flickered to the ground, then back to her. His lips parted slightly, as if he wanted to say something. But in the next second, his usual mask slid back into place. "You should go home, it's late," he said, turning on his heel. And just like that, the moment was gone. After that night, Lulitin changed. Not in the way Celine had hoped. Instead of warming up to her, he became even colder. He spoke to her only when necessary, never lingering, never making eye contact for too long. Meetings that used to have unspoken tension now felt painfully distant, like he was deliberately keeping a wall between them. At first, Celine thought she had imagined it, but then she overheard the office gossip. "Did you notice CEO Lu lately? He's been even more distant than usual." "I know, right? He usually ignores interns, but I swear he's avoiding Celine specifically." Maybe she did something to upset him? Celine frowned as she walked past her colleagues. Upset him? She had done nothing except pray. So why did it feel like her mere existence was a threat to him? Days turned into weeks, and Celine threw herself into work. If Lulitin wanted distance, she would respect it. One afternoon, She was rushing through the office halls, holding a thick folder of reports, when she collided hard into someone. The papers flew everywhere. "I'm so sorry," she started before freezing. It was him. Lulitin's hands were on her shoulders, steadying her before she could stumble. For the first time in weeks, their eyes met. Celine swallowed, heart pounding. She expected him to step away immediately, to retreat into his usual coldness. But he didn't. For a moment, just a moment, he hesitated. His hands remained firm on her shoulders, his grip neither too tight nor too light. Celine felt the heat of his touch through her blouse, her breath catching. Something flickered in his gaze, a crack in the ice. Then, as if snapping back to reality, Lulitin let go and took a step back. His expression hardened. "Be more careful next time," he muttered before walking away, leaving Celine standing there, breathless. That night, Lulitin sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the city below. He had built his life on control, on keeping emotions at bay, on ensuring that no one could ever get close enough to hurt him again. And yet, Celine was slipping through the cracks. Every time he tried to push her away, she found a way back in without even trying. He had seen her pray. He had seen her care. He had felt the warmth of her presence, and now it haunted him, even when she wasn't around. Grandpa Luo's words echoed in his mind. Not all love ends in pain. But Lulitin wasn't sure he was ready to believe that. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He shut himself down. Celine glanced at the towering stacks of documents on the desk and let out a quiet sigh. It was already past 10, and the office was nearly empty except for a few cleaning staff in the hallways. The golden glow of Shanghai's skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but she had no time to admire the view. Lulitin sat across from her, his sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened. He looked every bit the powerful CEO, calm, collected, untouchable. But tonight, she could see the fatigue lining his face. "We need to finalize this proposal before morning," he muttered, rubbing his temple. Celine nodded, pushing aside her exhaustion. "I'll handle the projections while you review the market analysis." They worked in near silence, their only communication brief exchanges about figures and projections. Yet, beneath the surface, an invisible tension crackled. Every glance, every moment of accidental eye contact sent an unspoken awareness between them. Celine tried to focus, but Lulitin's presence was overwhelming. She was drawn to him, and she hated that she was. Hours passed. The hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic typing on keyboards filled the office. Celine shifted in her chair, stretching her stiff shoulders. As she reached for a file, her fingers brushed against Lulitin's. A jolt of awareness shot through her. She quickly withdrew her hand, but the warmth lingered. Lulitin didn't move. His eyes flickered to her face, observing her reaction. There was something different in his expression, something almost vulnerable, as if he too was affected. The space between them felt smaller, the silence heavier. Celine swallowed, forcing herself to look away. "Focus, Celine," she told herself. For the next hour, they continued working, but the tension never eased. Celine was hyper-aware of every move Lulitin made. At one point, she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and from the corner of her eye, she caught him staring. Not in his usual indifferent way, but with an intensity that made her breath hitch. She turned to him, her heart pounding. Their eyes locked. Time seemed to slow. Then, without thinking, without planning, he leaned in, and so did she. Their lips met in a soft, fleeting kiss. For a heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. But just as quickly, Lulitin pulled away, his expression shifting. "This was a mistake," Lulitin said suddenly, standing up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Celine blinked, still trying to process what had just happened. A mistake. She felt a sharp pang in her chest. "Forget it happened," he added, his tone clipped, his usual cold mask returning. Celine inhaled deeply, willing herself not to react. She wanted to say something, wanted to demand why he kept shutting her out, but she knew she wouldn't get an answer. Instead, she quietly gathered her things. "I should go." And without another word, she walked out. Lu Litin sat alone in his office, staring at the empty chair where Celine had been just moments ago. What was happening to him? For years he had been careful, detached, controlled. Yet with Celine, he felt himself unraveling, and that terrified him. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "You're not as closed off as you think, Litin. You just don't want to risk being hurt again." He let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his hair. He needed to get a grip, because the more he let Celine in, the more dangerous this would become. Celine walked through the empty streets, the cool night air biting against her skin. She should have known better. She had seen the way Lu Litin closed himself off, the way he kept his emotions locked away, and yet some foolish part of her had begun to hope. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't understand what you're doing, but please guard my heart. Help me let go." She needed to move forward, but deep down, she knew her heart was already tangled up with someone who refused to let himself love. That night, Lu Litin sat in his penthouse, staring at the city lights. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He had seen Celine pray before, on the rooftop, in quiet corners of the office when she thought no one was watching. She was different, unshaken, at peace. And for the first time in his life, he wondered why. He picked up his phone, hesitated, then opened the App Store. His grandfather had mentioned it before, but he had never cared to check. Yet tonight, curiosity won. He downloaded a Bible app, and against all logic, he started reading. Lu Litin scrolled through the app, skimming through passages until a verse caught his eye. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. Rest. The word echoed in his mind. He shut his eyes, gripping the phone tightly. Why did it feel like these words were meant for him? He shook his head, shutting the app. This was ridiculous. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. The next morning, Celine arrived at work, determined to act as if nothing had happened. If Lu Litin wanted distance, she would give it to him. She went about her tasks with unwavering focus, avoiding his gaze whenever possible. But she could feel it, the weight of his eyes on her. He was watching her, not just in the way he usually did, but differently. And what Celine didn't know was that for the first time, Lu Litin wasn't just fighting his emotions. He was fighting the quiet growing pull of faith. That night, Lu Litin found himself reading again. This time he read about love, not the kind that abandoned, not the kind that left scars, but the kind that healed. Love is patient, love is kind. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. 1 Corinthians 13:4-7. He shut his phone, exhaling slowly. Celine's faith had given her peace. And for the first time in his life, Lu Litin wanted to understand why. The office was unusually quiet the next day. Celine went about her work, careful to avoid unnecessary interactions with Lu Litin. She told herself it was for the best. She needed distance to realign her heart, to focus on why she was here. But the weight of silence between them was unbearable. Even during meetings, his presence was overwhelming. Every time their gazes accidentally met, her heart clenched. He looked at her as if he wanted to say something, but he never did. And Celine refused to be the one to break the silence. Lu Litin wasn't himself. His assistant noticed it, his staff noticed it, even his grandfather noticed it. He was more withdrawn, distracted. More than once, he caught himself looking at Celine, watching the way she smiled at others, the way she carried herself with grace despite the pressure. And it frustrated him. Why was she always so steady? How could she move past what happened so easily, while he felt like his world had tilted? He needed to understand, and that desire gnawed at him more than he wanted to admit. "Something is on your mind, Litin." Lu Litin looked up from his tea, meeting his grandfather's wise eyes. "You've been unsettled lately. Is it work or something else?" Lu Litin hesitated. His grandfather had always been perceptive. He could see past the walls he had built. "It's nothing," he muttered. Grandpa Luo smiled knowingly. "Not all love ends in pain, my boy." Lu Litin stiffened. "That's not—" "You can lie to yourself, but your heart already knows the truth," his grandfather interrupted gently. "The question is, will you keep running from it?" Lulitin wasn't one to dwell on emotions, but that night his grandfather's words refused to leave him. Memories he had buried resurfaced. The last person he had loved the most had betrayed him. His mother had left him and his father for another man. He had watched his father drink himself to death, literally. His father could not handle the abandonment and drank every day to cope. When he was finally diagnosed with liver cirrhosis, it was too late. From then on, Lulitin had vowed never to let himself love any woman. But Celine, she was different. She wasn't calculating. She wasn't after his wealth or influence. And the way she lived, so full of faith, so unwavering, it fascinated him. Against his better judgment, he wanted to know more. That evening, unable to focus, Lulitin found himself walking toward the rooftop garden. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because that was the one place he had seen Celine pray. Maybe because he just wanted a moment of quiet. But when he stepped outside, he saw her. Celine was there, sitting on a bench, her hands clasped together, praying. For a moment, he just watched her, captivated by the peace on her face. She looked up suddenly, eyes widening when she saw him. Lulitin? He hesitated, then took a step closer. What do you pray for? He asked. Celine blinked, caught off guard by the question. Many things, she admitted. For wisdom, for strength, for the people around me. He studied her, his expression unreadable. Do you ever feel like your prayers go unanswered? Celine smiled softly. Sometimes. But faith isn't about getting everything I want. It's about trusting that God knows what's best, even when I don't understand. Lulitin absorbed her words in silence. It was a concept he had never considered before. He had always relied on himself, always controlled his own fate. But Celine, she lived differently. And that intrigued him. After that night, something shifted between them. They didn't talk about what happened in the office. They didn't talk about the kiss. But the silence wasn't as heavy anymore. It was as if an unspoken truce had been formed. Lulitin didn't fully understand his own feelings, but he knew one thing. He wasn't ready to let Celine go. And that terrified him. Days passed. Lulitin continued to read the Bible in secret. He wasn't sure what he was searching for. Answers? Peace? He didn't know. But he found himself drawn to the words. One evening he came across a passage that made him pause. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Proverbs 4:23. For years, he had guarded his heart too well. But now, for the first time, he wondered, had he been guarding it from the wrong thing? One afternoon, a client meeting ran late, forcing Celine and Lulitin to stay back once again. As they reviewed the final proposal, their chairs were too close, their voices too soft. Every time Celine shifted, Lulitin's heartbeat quickened, and when she reached for a pen, their hands brushed again. He sucked in a breath. This was dangerous. He had never struggled for control like this before, and yet, with Celine, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something he wasn't ready to face. That night, as Celine left the office, she felt an unexplainable peace. She still didn't know where things stood between her and Lulitin, but something inside her whispered that God was working. And he wasn't just working in her heart, he was working in his. On the other side of the city, Lulitin sat alone in his penthouse, staring at the Bible app on his phone. Slowly he opened it, and for the first time he wanted to believe. Lulitin leaned back on his couch, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. His chest tightened as he scrolled through the Bible app, rereading passages that Celine had mentioned in passing. He had spent years believing that power, control, and wealth were the only things that mattered, that faith was a crutch for the weak. But Celine wasn't weak. She was the strongest person he knew, steadfast, resilient, and at peace in ways he had never been. Why? What did she have that he didn't? His fingers tightened around his phone. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, maybe it's not about what she has, but who she belongs to. The thought unsettled him. Was it possible that all this time he had been chasing the wrong things? Meanwhile, Celine knelt by her bed, her heart heavy with emotions she couldn't name. She had spent the past weeks praying for Lulitin, and now Now something was shifting. She didn't know what God was doing, but she could sense it. Lord, I don't know where this is leading. I know Lu Li Teen is searching for something, but I also know I can't be the one to save him. You are. She exhaled, resting her hands on her lap. If it's your will, soften his heart, draw him to you, and if I'm meant to step back, give me the strength to do so. Her heart ached at the thought, because if she was honest, she didn't want to step back, but she would, if that's what obedience required. The next morning, Lu Li Teen's assistant informed Celine that she would be accompanying him on a business trip to Hong Kong. Celine's stomach twisted, spending several days in close proximity to him after everything felt dangerous. Yet she had no reason to refuse. As she packed her bags that evening, she whispered another prayer. Lord, help me guard my heart. Because she knew, no matter how much she tried to deny it, she was falling for him. The private jet was luxurious, sleek, and far too intimate for Celine's liking. Lu Li Teen barely spoke as they took off, his eyes focused on his laptop. But every now and then, she caught him glancing at her as if trying to figure something out. A few hours into the flight, turbulence hit. Celine gripped the armrest, closing her eyes. She wasn't afraid of flying, but the sudden jolt had startled her. A warm hand covered hers. She looked up. Lu Li Teen's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. Then just as quickly he withdrew his hand. Celine's heartbeat wouldn't slow down, and she knew this trip was going to test her in ways she wasn't prepared for. After a long day of meetings, Celine was surprised when Lu Li Teen suggested dinner. Just a business discussion, he clarified, but dinner with him felt anything but business-like. As they sat in the dimly lit restaurant, conversation flowed more easily than she expected. He asked her about her life, her faith, things he had never openly questioned before. At one point, he leaned back, watching her intently. "You really believe it all, don't you?" he murmured. Celine's gaze softened. "With all my heart." For a long moment, he said nothing. And then, so softly she almost missed it, he whispered, "I wish I could." Her breath caught. Because maybe, just maybe, he was closer to believing than he realized. After dinner, they took a walk along the quiet streets near the hotel. Celine loved moments like these, the world slowing down, allowing space for reflection. Lu Li Teen walked beside her, his hands in his pockets. "I don't get it," he admitted suddenly. "How do you trust God when life doesn't make sense?" Celine smiled faintly. Because faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I want to believe," he admitted, "but I don't know how." Celine's heart clenched. This was it, a breakthrough, and she knew God was moving. As they neared the hotel, Lu Li Teen suddenly stopped. "There's something about you, Celine," he said quietly, "something that scares me." Her breath caught. "Why?" "Because you make me want things I never thought I'd want." The confession sent a shiver through her. She knew she should say something wise, something safe. But all she could whisper was, "Like what?" His gaze darkened. "Like faith," he murmured, "like hope. And then even softer, like you." Celine's heart pounded. This was dangerous. If she let her emotions lead, she could get caught in something she wasn't meant to be part of. And yet, she cared for him. Deeply. The way Lu Li Teen looked at her, intense, searching, made it impossible to breathe. He wasn't wearing his usual mask of control. For once, his guard was down, and in his eyes, she saw something she had never seen before. Longing. Not just for her, but for something deeper, something he couldn't even name yet. "Lu Li Teen?" she started, but he shook his head. "I know," he said quietly. "You don't have to say it. I needed you to know." Celine closed her eyes for a brief moment. "Lord, help me do what's right." Because right now, the line between wisdom and desire was far too thin. But when she opened her eyes and saw the vulnerability in his expression, something inside her cracked. Without thinking, she stepped closer. And then, before fear could stop her, she reached up and kissed him. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if testing the weight of this moment. But when he responded, his hands sliding gently to her waist, his lips pressing against hers with more certainty, Celine felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something that scared her. The warmth of his touch sent shivers through her. But before she lost herself completely, she forced herself to pull away. Luli Teen's breath was uneven, his forehead resting against hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "I don't want to lose you." Celine swallowed hard. "You won't," she whispered. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her heart. Because she knew, if they weren't careful, this could end in a way neither of them was ready for. That night, Luli Teen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the memory of Celine's lips against his still lingering in his mind. The kiss had been unexpected, gentle yet powerful, hesitant yet full of meaning. He had kissed women before many times, but never like this. Never with this depth of feeling. And it wasn't just the kiss itself, it was what it represented. Something was changing between them, something he wasn't sure how to handle. His conversation with Celine replayed over and over again. Her warmth, the way she had looked at him afterward, the way she had pulled away, like she was afraid of what they were stepping into. For so long he had fought against faith, against surrender. But maybe surrender wasn't weakness. Maybe it was strength. His fingers hovered over his phone before he finally picked it up and opened the Bible app again. This time he didn't just skim the words. He let them sink in. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. Proverbs 3:5. Luli Teen exhaled slowly. Leaning on something other than himself had never been an option before, but Celine lived her life this way, trusting in something bigger than herself, and somehow she carried a peace he had never known. Could he have that too? His throat tightened as he hesitated. Then, in a whisper, he muttered the words that felt both foreign and strangely right. "God, if you're real, help me believe." The room remained silent. There was no sudden revelation, no dramatic sign. But there was a flicker of peace. And for now, that was enough. The next morning, Celine walked into the office, trying to push aside the memory of their kiss. But it was impossible. Her fingers brushed against her lips absently as she took a deep breath. What had she done? Was it a mistake? Or was it simply something she had needed to do to show him, even without words, how much she cared? She wasn't sure. But as she stepped into the meeting room, she noticed something different about Luli Teen. He was quieter, not in his usual closed-off way, but in a contemplative, searching way. And when their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them. He remembered too. As they left for their final meeting of the day, he suddenly turned to her. "I read more of the Bible last night." Celine's heart leaped. She forced herself to stay calm. "And?" she asked, her voice careful. His lips twitched slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "And I think I finally understand why you believe." Celine felt hope bloom in her chest. It wasn't a full conversion. It wasn't a declaration of faith. But it was something. A beginning, and sometimes beginnings were enough. Luli Teen sat alone in his hotel room that night, the city lights of Hong Kong casting long shadows across the floor. He had spent the past few days in an internal battle, fighting against what he already knew in his heart. Celine's faith had been unwavering, and he had witnessed the peace it brought her. He had read the scriptures, seeking understanding, and yet surrender felt terrifying. All his life, he had relied on himself. His success had been built on strategy, power, and control. But now, for the first time, he was faced with something beyond his control. The truth. His gaze drifted to the Bible app still open on his phone. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has gone, the new is here. 2 Corinthians 5:17. A new creation. Could he really be made new? Closing his eyes, he exhaled deeply. "God, if you are real, I can't keep running from you. Show me what to do." The next morning, Luli Teen met Celine for breakfast. He didn't speak immediately, but she noticed the difference in his demeanor. His guarded walls weren't completely down, but something had shifted. "Celine," he finally said, voice low, thoughtful, "what does it really mean to follow Christ?" Celine's breath hitched. She had prayed for this moment. "It means surrender," she said gently. "It means accepting that we are not enough on our own, that we need him to save us." He looked down, nodding slightly. "I've spent my whole life trying to be strong, trying to prove myself, but I'm realizing now, strength isn't in control. Strength is in surrender." Celine reached for his hand. "Yes, and God isn't asking you to be perfect. He's asking you to trust him." For a long moment, Lu Litin said nothing. Then he took a deep breath and whispered, "I want to believe." Celine smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "Then let's pray." They bowed their heads, and Lu Litin repeated after her, his voice shaky at first, but growing stronger with each word. "Lord Jesus, I come before you knowing that I cannot save myself. I believe you died for my sins and rose again to give me new life. I surrender my heart to you. Be my Savior, my Lord and my guide. Change me, make me new. In Jesus' name, amen." The moment he finished, Lu Litin exhaled sharply, as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. Peace, real peace, settled over him for the first time in his life. He opened his eyes and met Celine's gaze, and for the first time he truly saw her. Their time in Hong Kong was coming to an end. That night, Lu Litin invited Celine to the rooftop garden one last time. The air was crisp and the stars shone above them. He turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I've spent so many years chasing things that don't matter," he said quietly. "Power, status, success. But none of it gave me peace." Celine watched him, waiting. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing lightly over her fingers. "But you changed everything." She swallowed hard. "Lu Litin, I love you." Her heart stopped. "I fought it, Celine. I fought it because I was afraid. But I love you, and I don't want to waste another moment pretending I don't." Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I love you too." And this time, when he leaned in, she didn't hesitate. Their kiss was slow, reverent, an unspoken promise of all that was to come. Back in Shanghai, Lu Litin had one final plan. At a dinner he had arranged for his business associates, he stood to make a toast. But instead of speaking about business, he turned to Celine, his eyes filled with conviction. "Celine, from the moment I met you, you have been a light in my life. You taught me what it means to believe, to surrender, to truly live. And now I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Gasps echoed around the room as he pulled out a velvet box and opened it. Inside was a diamond ring, gleaming under the chandelier light. "Will you marry me?" Celine felt her breath leave her chest. She looked into his eyes no longer guarded, no longer afraid. "Yes," she whispered, nodding. And as he slid the ring onto her finger, she knew this was exactly where God had meant for them to be. The sun cast a golden glow over the garden, where friends, family, and business associates gathered to witness the union of Lu Litin and Celine. It was a wedding unlike any Shanghai's high society had seen before, not extravagant, but deeply meaningful. Instead of a grand ballroom, they chose an elegant yet intimate garden venue. Instead of a lavish display of wealth, the focus was on the presence of God in their lives. Celine stood at the end of the aisle, breathtaking in a white gown that flowed like water. Her eyes locked onto Lu Litin, who stood waiting at the altar, looking at her with an expression of awe. As she walked toward him, a scripture filled her heart. "He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord." Proverbs 18:22. The ceremony was simple yet powerful. They exchanged vows, promising to honor God first, then each other. And when the pastor said, "You may kiss the bride," Lu Litin cupped Celine's face with the gentleness of a man who had been forever changed. Their kiss was not just a seal of love, but of a divine purpose. Returning to work after their honeymoon, Celine noticed an immediate shift in the atmosphere at the office. The once intimidating and cutthroat corporate environment had changed. And the biggest change, Lu Litin. Gone was the cold, commanding businessman who only cared about results. In his place was a man who led with integrity, kindness, and wisdom. At first, people didn't know what to make of it. Whispers filled the hallways. "It's like he's a totally new person. What did you do to him in Hong Kong, Celine? He actually listens now. He never used to care about people like this. Some were simply curious. Others wanted whatever it was he had. It started with one of the junior employees. During lunch break, she approached Celine hesitantly. "Mrs. Liu," she said shyly. Celine smiled. She was still getting used to the new name. "Call me Celine." The young woman bit her lip before whispering, "I want what Mr. Liu has. That peace, that joy. What happened to him?" Celine's heart swelled. "It wasn't me," she said gently. "It was Jesus." The woman's eyes widened. "Jesus? But I thought Christianity was just a Western belief." Celine chuckled. "No, Jesus is for everyone." That was the moment the idea was born. A prayer and Bible study hour during lunch breaks. A safe space where people could ask questions and explore faith. And to her surprise, people came. At first it was only a few, then more. Soon, nearly a third of the office was attending, and it was changing lives. One evening, as Celine was organizing materials for the Bible study, Lu Teen walked into her office. He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "I have something to discuss with you." She looked up, curious. "What is it?" He stepped forward, taking her hands in his. "You've been more than an assistant to me. You've been my partner, my guide, and now my wife." She smiled. And I want you to take on a new role in the company." Celine frowned slightly. "New role?" "I want you to lead our corporate social responsibility department," he said, officially. She blinked. "Wait, you mean—" He nodded. "We've already started supporting children's homes, scholarships and missionary work, but I want to do more, and I want you to run it." Tears welled in her eyes. "Lu Teen, I don't know what to say." "Say yes." She laughed, throwing her arms around him. "Yes." Years later, as they stood in an orphanage they had helped build, Celine and Lu Teen watched as children played joyfully around them. The once feared billionaire had become a man of compassion, a man of purpose. And Celine, she had found her calling, not just as his wife, but as a vessel for God's work. Their days were spent pouring into the lives of others, orphans, the elderly, students who couldn't afford an education. They traveled across China, secretly funding missionaries who were bringing the gospel to places where faith was suppressed. They were no longer just building wealth. They were building legacy. One evening, as they sat on their balcony overlooking the city, Lu Teen took Celine's hand. "We were made for this," he said softly. She nodded, smiling. "Yes, we were." And together, they whispered the scripture that had become their life's mission. "For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." Ephesians 2:10. The end.